A few years ago, I was working late at a job in the city. My shifts often ended around 1 a.m., and I had grown accustomed to walking home in the quiet of the early morning hours. On one particular night, as the mist from a recent rain hung low and the streetlights glow, I began my walk home. It was a typical night, with the streets nearly deserted and the occasional car passing by. I had just turned onto my usual route when I noticed a figure standing under a street lamp up ahead. He was a man in a dark suit and tie, his face framed by the harsh, yellow light. What struck me was not just his presence, but his expression. He wore a wide, unsettling grin that stretched unnaturally across his face. It was the kind of smile you'd expect from a character in a horror film, creepy and disconcerting. Despite the chill in the air, I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back. I glanced at him briefly and then quickly looked away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I picked up my pace, hoping to get home as quickly as possible. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that he had begun to walk as well, maintaining his position under the street lamp but watching me intently. As I continued, the street seemed to stretch out longer than usual. I looked back, and the man was still there, his smile as wide and eerie as ever. A wave of panic washed over me. I considered crossing the street, but there was something in his eyes, a cold, calculating gaze, that made me hesitate. I knew that if I crossed the street, he might follow, and I'd be left more exposed. Trying to calm myself, I took a deep breath and turned down a side street, hoping to put more distance between us. The street was narrower and less well lit, with shadows that seemed to come alive in the dim light. I could hear my footsteps echoing off the walls of the nearby buildings. I kept glancing back, and to my growing horror, the man was still following me. He had left the street lamp behind and was now walking in my direction with that same unnerving grin. I quickened my pace, nearly breaking into a run, but every time I looked back, he was there, keeping up effortlessly. I felt like I was being stalked by some malevolent force. My heart pounded in my chest, and every shadow seemed to conceal a new threat. Eventually, I reached my apartment building. With trembling hands, I fumbled with my keys and managed to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it with a sense of relief. I peered through the peephole, but the man had disappeared into the night. Still, the image of that grin haunted me as I lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I read in the newspaper about a series of strange encounters reported in various parts of the city. People had described seeing a man in a suit with a disturbing smile, and it seemed to be a growing phenomenon. Some accounts mentioned similar unsettling behaviors, always watching, never approaching too closely, just maintaining that unnervingly wide grin. As the days went by, the stories continued to spread. It seemed like the smiling man was appearing in different neighborhoods, always at night and always with that same creepy smile. The local police were baffled, unable to find any leads or explanations for the sightings. There were no reports of violence or threats, just the unnerving presence and the wide, haunting smile. I couldn't escape the fear that the smiling man would return. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially when walking alone at night. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and every stranger with a smile seemed to be him. Even now, years later, I occasionally catch myself glancing over my shoulder or peeking through the window late at night, half expecting to see that sinister grin in the darkness. The smiling man never did show up again in my neighborhood, but the stories persisted. He became a kind of urban legend, a ghostly figure that haunted the collective imagination of the city. The tales of the smiling man serve as a chilling reminder of the fears that lurk just out of sight and the unsettling feeling of being watched.